March 1943. Over the skies of Europe, a German Luftwaffe pilot sweeps the horizon, eyes narrowed in anticipation of the next Allied bomber formation. The air is thick with the sound of engines, and every shadow in the clouds is a potential target. For months, the German pilots have been executing successful raids, their planes darting in and out of the skies, taking advantage of their speed and surprise. But today is different. Something feels off. They cannot pinpoint it, but the air seems heavier, the threat unseen but palpable. As the German pilots prepare to strike, their radar screens flicker to life, and the unmistakable shapes of American bombers materialize on the horizon. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots have grown accustomed to destroying bombers, but today's encounter is like no other. Despite the swiftness of their attack, they cannot seem to catch the American bombers. No matter how hard they dive, no matter how fast they go, the bombers remain just out of reach. Frustration mounts as they watch, helpless. As Allied fighters appear to protect the bombers with ease, intercepting the German aircraft with precision, the realization hits hard. The Americans' radar technology has evolved beyond anything the German pilots had prepared for. In that moment, the German pilots know they are facing a new kind of warfare, one where technology is as much of an enemy as the aircraft in the sky. The overwhelming feeling of helplessness sets in. This new tool, radar, is something they never saw coming. And with that, the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies begins to slip away. As the Allied forces have turned the tide of air combat with technology that makes the invisible visible. By 1943, the tide of the Second World War had begun to turn against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant air force in Europe, had faced significant setbacks, particularly in the Battle of Britain, and had suffered heavy losses in the air battles over the Eastern Front. The introduction of advanced Allied technology, especially radar, was about to tilt the balance of air combat in favor of the United States and Great Britain. The Germans, accustomed to their dominance in the skies, were now about to experience a major shift in how the war was being fought above them. Radar technology, first used by the British during the Battle of Britain, had rapidly evolved into a vital tool for the Allied forces. In the early stages of the war, both the British and the Germans were aware of radar's potential. The British had developed radar systems that allowed them to detect incoming Luftwaffe bombers from hundreds of miles away, giving them crucial time to scramble fighter planes and launch intercepts. This, in part, was responsible for their success during the Battle of Britain, where radar played a crucial role in the defense of the British Isles. However, it was the rapid advancement of American radar technology, in combination with the development of long-range bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, that would bring about a strategic revolution in the air war over Europe. By the early 1940s, the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, had begun to deploy radar systems on their bombers, which allowed them to detect enemy fighters long before they could engage the bombers. This new technology significantly altered the air combat dynamic. The Germans, who had relied on surprise attacks, speed, and maneuverability, were now facing a powerful countermeasure: the ability for their enemies to see them before they could strike. While Germany had its own radar technology, it was not as advanced as the systems being deployed by the Allies. The Germans, still reliant on their ability to outmaneuver their enemies in the skies, were caught off guard by the development and deployment of radar systems capable of tracking aircraft at great distances. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces began to install radar on their bombers and on early warning systems on the ground, significantly boosting their ability to protect their aircraft from German fighters. The introduction of radar on American bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, was a game-changer. These bombers, once vulnerable to German fighters, were now able to detect enemy aircraft far earlier in the approach, giving gunners and escorts the time to respond and intercept them before they could cause damage. The American bombers, in effect, became more difficult to attack, as the Germans found it harder to catch them off guard. The B-17 Flying Fortress, which had already gained a reputation for its ability to absorb hits and still complete missions, was now an even more formidable adversary with the addition of radar technology. The Germans, who had been accustomed to the quick and decisive nature of aerial combat, now had to face a new kind of warfare. The radar-equipped bombers and early warning systems allowed the Allies to execute highly coordinated air raids with significantly less risk. As the Allies began to perfect their use of radar, the Luftwaffe found itself outmaneuvered, no longer able to rely on surprise attacks and their superior flying skills. The ability of American and British aircraft to detect German fighters long before they could close in for an attack fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the skies over Europe. In addition to the strategic advantage provided by radar, the U.S. and British forces were also benefiting from advances in fighter escorts. American P-51 Mustang fighters, which had long range and exceptional speed, began to accompany the bombers on missions deep into enemy territory. These fighters, along with radar-equipped bombers, made it increasingly difficult for the Germans to mount successful attacks on Allied formations. The Luftwaffe, once an elite fighting force, found itself increasingly unable to counter the growing technological advantage of the Allies. The Germans, who had been so reliant on the tactical superiority of their pilots and their aircraft, now faced an adversary that could see them coming and respond accordingly. This technological shift, driven by radar, was a profound psychological blow to the German pilots, who had previously considered themselves the masters of the skies. The once feared Luftwaffe pilots, who had dominated dogfights with their agility and speed, now found themselves unable to surprise or outmaneuver the American and British aircraft that could detect them from miles away. For the seasoned German pilots, the realization that they were now facing an enemy equipped with radar was nothing short of a psychological shock. These pilots, who had once believed they were the masters of the skies, now found themselves in a battle where their most relied-upon tactics, speed, surprise, and maneuverability, were no longer enough to guarantee success. Their sense of invincibility, built over years of dominance in aerial combat, was now shaken. German pilots had long been trained to trust their instincts, to outfly and outmaneuver their enemies in the chaotic dogfights that defined the early stages of the war. They had learned how to anticipate the movements of Allied aircraft, often relying on their superior training and knowledge of the skies. However, with the introduction of radar technology by the Americans, their once reliable methods were rendered obsolete. The Germans could no longer surprise their opponents with sudden dives or stealthy approaches. Instead, their every move was anticipated, and their chances of success were increasingly limited. The emotional toll on these pilots was immense. They had once been hailed as the best in the world, their skill and bravery celebrated within Nazi propaganda. To suddenly realize that their tactics were being countered so effectively by a technology they had not fully understood was devastating. Many of the Luftwaffe's best aces, who had once dominated dogfights, were now being forced to fight an adversary that seemed prepared for every move. The realization that radar-equipped bombers and long-range escorts had leveled the playing field was a bitter pill to swallow. The psychological weight of this shift in air combat was not just about losing individual battles. It was about the collapse of their belief in their superiority. For some, the emotional toll was compounded by a deep sense of frustration and confusion. The pilots were accustomed to a system where their skills and bravery mattered above all else. But with radar technology, it was no longer just about individual skill. It was about being able to anticipate and respond to a threat that could see them coming from miles away. The realization that their expertise was no longer enough to overcome the technological advancements of their enemies was a humbling experience. For many German pilots, this marked the beginning of the end. Their morale began to wane as they faced the stark reality that the advantage they had once held was slipping away. The introduction of radar technology to Allied bombers fundamentally changed the nature of air combat in Europe. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on surprise attacks, diving from above and using their speed and agility to overpower Allied bombers. The pilots of the Luftwaffe were trained to strike quickly and decisively, often relying on their superior flying skills to gain an advantage in battle. Their success had been built on the principle of maneuverability and speed, both of which allowed them to close in on bombers before they could mount a defense. But with the arrival of radar-equipped bombers, the game had changed. Radar gave the Allies the ability to detect incoming enemy aircraft from miles away, giving them the upper hand in nearly every encounter. This shift in air combat strategy rendered many of the Luftwaffe's tactics obsolete. The once dominant German pilots, who had relied on surprise and ambush to win their battles, now found themselves facing bombers that could anticipate their every move. This technological shift required the Germans to adapt their strategies on the fly, but they struggled to keep up. The Luftwaffe's response was to develop their own radar systems, but by the time they did, the Allies had already gained a significant technological advantage. The American P-51 Mustang fighters, which could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, were now operating with the added advantage of radar-equipped bombers that could see German fighters coming from miles away. The tactical situation for the Germans grew increasingly dire, as they found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned by a technology they hadn't fully grasped. The shift in strategy also affected the role of the German pilots. In the early days of the war, the pilots had been the stars of the show, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's air superiority. They had been celebrated for their individual skill and bravery, and their victories had bolstered the morale of the Nazi regime. However, with radar technology now in play, the focus of air combat had shifted from individual skill to technological advantage. The Allies' ability to coordinate their bombers and escort fighters supported by radar was now the determining factor in the outcome of aerial engagements. This shift in strategy was not just tactical, it was philosophical, as the Germans found themselves confronted with a new reality. In modern warfare, technology was often more important than individual prowess. The tactical shift required the Germans to change their approach to air combat, but they were slow to adapt. They continued to rely on the traditional methods of dogfighting and surprise attacks, which were no longer effective against the radar-equipped Allied bombers and fighter escorts. As the war went on, the Luftwaffe found itself on the defensive, struggling to mount an effective counterattack against the superior technology and tactics of the Allies. The turning point in the battle for air superiority over Europe came in the months following the Allies' introduction of radar technology, with one of the most significant moments occurring during the Allied strategic bombing campaign over Germany. In 1943, the Americans and the British began to execute increasingly coordinated bombing raids over German industrial centers, transportation hubs, and military installations. The bombers, which had long been vulnerable to the swift and deadly attacks of the Luftwaffe, were now shielded by an innovative form of protection: radar-equipped bombers and long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang. The German Luftwaffe, initially confident in their ability to stop the Allied bombers, found themselves increasingly helpless in the face of this new threat. Their once successful tactics of surprise attacks, diving from above and catching Allied bombers off guard, were now rendered ineffective. As radar allowed the bombers to detect incoming enemy aircraft from miles away, the Luftwaffe pilots found that their every move was anticipated. In one particular raid, German pilots, who had spent years honing their skills and priding themselves on their superiority in the skies, faced a new kind of adversary. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter escort, had been designed to accompany bombers deep into enemy territory. But now, the bombers themselves had the ability to detect incoming threats through radar. This combination of advanced American fighters and radar-equipped bombers created a perfect storm for the Luftwaffe. The German pilots, attempting to intercept the bombers, were met not only with fierce resistance from the Mustang escorts, but with the added disadvantage of being detected well before they could strike. The first significant shock to the German pilots came when they tried to approach a formation of American bombers, only to find that they had been spotted miles away. The Allies' ability to track the Germans and deploy fighter escorts in perfect coordination effectively neutralized the Luftwaffe's traditional advantage of surprise and speed. The German pilots, who had once relied on their agility and their experience in high-speed attacks, now found themselves being forced into defensive positions, struggling to outmaneuver an enemy that could see them coming. The emotional realization that they could no longer rely on the very tactics that had made them the fearsome force they had once been was a devastating blow to the Luftwaffe's morale. For the Germans, the technology that had shifted the tide was not just radar, it was the strategic use of that technology. While the Allies had perfected their coordination of radar with bombers and fighter escorts, the Germans, slow to develop and deploy radar technology of their own, were at a severe disadvantage. The Germans, who had prided themselves on their technological superiority and had built their strategy around the effectiveness of their aircraft and pilots, found themselves facing an enemy that had learned to exploit the new technologies better and faster. The combination of radar and advanced fighter tactics turned the American bombers from vulnerable targets into near-impregnable fortresses. With the ability to detect German aircraft before they could launch an attack, the U.S. Army Air Forces could now take the fight directly to the heart of Germany, unimpeded by the Luftwaffe's interceptors. As more German planes were destroyed during these engagements, and with radar-equipped bombers becoming more prevalent, the Luftwaffe's ability to protect Germany's skies gradually deteriorated. The final blow came during Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944. By this time, the Allies had gained complete air superiority over Europe, and the Luftwaffe could do little to prevent the Allied invasion force from landing in France. The Germans, unable to counter the Allies' radar technology and their overwhelming air superiority, found themselves unable to stop the ground invasion, marking a decisive shift in the war. Radar, once an underestimated technological advancement, had now become a key factor in the downfall of the Luftwaffe and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The shift in the balance of air combat power was undeniable. The Germans, who had dominated the skies early in the war, were now struggling to keep up with the rapid advancements made by the Allies. The introduction of radar technology, combined with better coordination, superior numbers, and the relentless pressure from Allied bombers, marked the end of Germany's air superiority. The emotional and tactical toll on the Luftwaffe pilots was immense, and as the Allied forces gained control of the skies, the Germans were left with few options to reverse their deteriorating position. As 1944 unfolded, the air battles over Europe reached a fever pitch, and the effects of the Allies' technological advancements, particularly radar, became increasingly evident in the Luftwaffe's rapid decline. The Germans, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, now found themselves fighting a war of attrition in the air. The realization among German pilots that their traditional methods of attack were no longer effective was driven home by the sheer number of Allied bombers and fighters that were constantly overhead, many of them capable of detecting incoming German aircraft from miles away. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, during the Allied invasion of Normandy, was a definitive example of how radar technology had shifted the air combat landscape. The Luftwaffe, desperate to stop the Allied advance, launched a series of attacks with their remaining fighters. However, they were met by the overwhelming force of the U.S. Army Air Forces, which now had both radar-equipped bombers and long-range fighter escorts that were able to engage the German fighters before they could even get within striking distance of their intended targets. This battle, which saw hundreds of German aircraft lost in a matter of days, underscored the irreversible shift in air power. German pilots, once masters of the skies, were no longer able to use their speed and agility to launch surprise attacks. The presence of radar-equipped bombers and fighter escorts meant that every move the Germans made was countered before it could even begin. The Germans, still clinging to outdated tactics, were caught in an ever-tightening noose. The idea that the Americans could anticipate their every move was a bitter realization, one that deeply shook the morale of the Luftwaffe pilots who had once been the pride of Nazi propaganda. For the German High Command, the consequences of losing air superiority were devastating. The ability to strike at enemy targets had been the cornerstone of their war strategy, particularly in terms of disrupting Allied supply lines, bombing runs, and troop movements. Without control of the skies, the Germans were unable to effectively carry out these operations. The loss of radar-based intelligence and the inability to prevent Allied bombers from reaching their targets marked the slow, agonizing defeat of the Luftwaffe in the war. One of the most crucial moments that highlighted the turning point in air superiority came during the Allied bombing raids over Germany in late 1944 and early 1945. The Allies, now free to attack with impunity, turned their focus to key German cities, industrial centers, and military installations. The bombing raids intensified, with massive formations of American B-17s and B-24s taking to the skies. These bombers, now protected by radar-equipped systems and long-range fighter escorts, were able to strike deep into the heart of Germany without fear of significant aerial opposition. The Luftwaffe, crippled by losses, could do little to defend its cities. German pilots, many of whom were inexperienced or newly trained due to the massive losses of older, more experienced airmen, could not effectively challenge the radar-enhanced American formations. With radar, the Allies had gained the ability to strike at the heart of the Nazi war machine, crippling their industry, transportation networks, and military infrastructure in ways the Germans could not respond to. For the German pilots, who had once boasted about their ability to defeat any enemy, the sight of American bombers flying over their cities with impunity was a crushing blow. The psychological impact was profound. Once hailed as the most elite airmen in the world, they now faced an enemy that had adapted and evolved beyond their reach. The realization that radar was one of the primary forces behind the Americans' ability to dominate the skies came too late. The Luftwaffe's once unshakable confidence was now replaced with fear and uncertainty. As the war progressed, and with the American radar technology becoming even more advanced, the Luftwaffe's ability to mount any meaningful defense evaporated. Their fighters, once capable of engaging in high-speed dogfights, were now being hunted by radar-guided interceptors. The technological advantage that the Allies had established was simply insurmountable. The Luftwaffe, unable to adapt quickly enough, became nothing more than a shadow of its former self. The loss of air superiority over Europe meant that the Germans were increasingly unable to respond to the advancing Allied forces. The lack of effective air cover allowed the U.S. and British forces to carry out sustained offensives with minimal interference. In 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and moved deeper into Germany, the absence of a strong Luftwaffe presence became glaringly apparent. The Nazis, with their once vaunted air force shattered, could do little to slow the inevitable advance of the Allied forces. The aftermath of the technological shift caused by radar, along with the crushing losses sustained by the Luftwaffe in 1944 and 1945, sealed the fate of Nazi Germany's aerial dominance. By the time the war reached its final stages, the Luftwaffe's once feared pilots were no longer able to challenge the growing Allied air superiority. The Germans' inability to counter the radar-enhanced bombing raids marked the beginning of the end for their military strength in the skies. The immediate result of the loss of air superiority was the overwhelming success of Allied bombing campaigns. With radar systems in place, U.S. bombers could carry out their missions with increased precision, striking critical military and industrial targets deep within Germany. These raids severely crippled Germany's ability to produce war material disrupt their transportation infrastructure, and impede the movement of troops. Key cities, factories, and military installations were bombed relentlessly, causing devastating damage that would take years to repair. For the German civilians, the consequences of losing the skies were disastrous. The once feared Luftwaffe could no longer provide protection, leaving the cities vulnerable to daily air raids by the Allies. The bombing campaigns not only destroyed Germany's military infrastructure, but also decimated civilian areas, leading to widespread suffering, displacement, and loss of life. Many German cities were reduced to rubble, and the civilian population, already reeling from the hardships of war, now found themselves at the mercy of relentless bombardment. In addition to the destruction of infrastructure, the moral and psychological toll on the German people was immense. The loss of air superiority meant that Germany's capacity to resist was severely limited. The American and British air forces, free to strike at will, had destroyed the very heart of the Nazi war machine. German citizens, who had once been told that victory was within reach, were now faced with the reality of defeat. The Allies were no longer just fighting a war of attrition. They were systematically dismantling the Nazi regime, one airstrike at a time. For the German military leadership, the loss of the Luftwaffe's capabilities signaled the end of effective resistance. The Luftwaffe had been one of the most powerful forces in Europe, and its collapse symbolized the disintegration of Germany's military power. The Germans, who had once relied on their air force to maintain control of occupied territories and defend against Allied advances, now found themselves defenseless in the face of overwhelming air power. The Allies had effectively neutralized Germany's ability to defend its borders or conduct offensive operations. The technological advantage provided by radar meant that the Allies could strike with impunity, leaving the German forces unable to mount a meaningful defense. The impact on the German military was not just material, it was psychological. The Luftwaffe's pilots, once considered the elite of the German military, now found themselves unable to carry out the same tactics that had brought them success in the early years of the war. Their failure to adapt to the new realities of radar technology, combined with the depletion of their experienced pilots, left them vulnerable and ineffective. The morale of the German Air Force had been shattered, and it was no longer a force to be reckoned with. For the US and British forces, the end of German air superiority marked a major victory. The Allies had successfully neutralized the Luftwaffe, securing the skies over Europe and ensuring that the land forces could operate with relative impunity. The Allies' ability to strike at Germany's heart, without fear of retaliation, allowed them to carry out sustained offensives that ultimately brought an end to the war in Europe. The Allies, bolstered by radar technology and superior air tactics, were now in control, and the defeat of Germany was no longer a question of if, but when. By 1945, the complete collapse of Germany's aerial defense was fully realized. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of Nazi military might, was now effectively neutralized. The Germans could no longer hold their ground against the Allied air forces, who had secured uncontested air superiority across Europe. The destruction of key military installations, the decimation of aircraft factories, and the loss of experienced pilots had crippled Germany's ability to defend itself or conduct offensive operations. The Allied bombers, equipped with radar technology, could now operate with impunity, devastating critical infrastructure with minimal interference. The devastating impact of this loss was felt not only militarily, but also socially and politically. The German civilian population, already reeling from years of war, now faced the consequences of a near-total collapse in their nation's defense capability. As the Allies continued their air raids, the already struggling German economy was further crippled. Factories were destroyed, transportation lines disrupted, and critical supplies, such as fuel and food, were in short supply. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect German cities meant that air raids could be carried out without fear of interception, leading to devastating bombing campaigns. particularly in the final months of the war. In 1944 and 1945, the Allied forces escalated their strategic bombing campaigns, targeting key German industrial centers, transportation hubs, and military installations with devastating precision. The use of radar-equipped bombers and fighter escorts allowed the Allies to effectively overwhelm German defenses and hit their targets with near unprecedented accuracy. Cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and many others were bombed relentlessly. While the Germans had previously been able to mount some form of resistance to Allied raids, their defenses were now utterly ineffective. This marked a significant shift. The Allies had gone from defending their airspace to becoming the undisputed masters of it. The psychological effect on both the German leadership and civilian population was profound. The realization that the Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was powerless against Allied aircraft was a crushing blow. The once proud German military, which had been built on the principles of technological superiority and strategic brilliance, was now scrambling to keep up with advancements in radar technology and the growing might of the American and British air forces. The constant barrage of Allied bombers and fighters, combined with the devastating effect of radar-guided airstrikes, left the German military unable to respond. As the war drew to a close, the destruction of Germany's military infrastructure became a symbol of their defeat. The Luftwaffe, now a shadow of its former self, was no longer capable of mounting any significant defense against the advancing Allied forces. The failure of the Luftwaffe's leadership to adapt to new technology, combined with the overwhelming might of the Allied air forces, sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. By the time Berlin fell to Soviet forces in May 1945, the Luftwaffe was a broken force, unable to provide any support to the German army or defend against the overwhelming Allied offensive. For the US and British forces, the success of radar and the overwhelming superiority of their air forces represented the culmination of years of technological and tactical evolution. The Allies had turned the tide of the war not just with brute force, but with intelligence, innovation, and adaptation to the changing nature of modern warfare. Radar had played a crucial role in this transformation, allowing the Allies to effectively neutralize the Luftwaffe and gain uncontested control of the skies. The ability to see the enemy before they could strike, to anticipate and counter their every move, was a decisive advantage that the Germans had not expected and could not overcome. The collapse of the Luftwaffe marked the end of Germany's ability to resist the Allies, both in the air and on the ground. The Allies now controlled the skies, and their strategic bombing campaigns would continue to devastate Germany until the end of the war. The psychological toll on the German military, as they faced the realization that their air force could no longer defend them, was immense. The loss of air superiority, combined with the Allied forces' overwhelming air presence, ensured that Nazi Germany would never be able to regain its military power. In the years following the war, the technological advantage provided by radar would have lasting effects on military strategy. The lessons learned from the battle for air superiority in Europe would shape the development of air forces and radar systems for generations to come. The Allies' ability to dominate the skies with radar-equipped bombers and fighter escorts not only secured their victory in World War II, but also set the stage for the future of modern air combat. Untermining, destruction of the Luftwaffe, and with it, Germany's ability to defend itself, marked the end of the war in Europe. The American and British air forces, empowered by radar technology, had broken the back of Nazi Germany's military machine. With the skies firmly in Allied hands, the defeat of the Third Reich was inevitable. Downfall of the Luftwaffe, and the pivotal role that radar technology played in shifting the balance of air power during World War II is a testament to how technological advancements can fundamentally alter the course of history. For the German pilots, the realization that they were up against a force they could not see nor defeat was both a tactical and psychological blow. The Luftwaffe had once been a symbol of German power and superiority in the skies, and now, confronted with radar-equipped bombers and the unrelenting air superiority of the Allies, its demise marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's military dominance. The loss of air superiority for the Germans was not merely a loss of planes or ships, it was the loss of their strategic advantage. Radar, which had once been a tool for the Allies' defense, became a weapon of offense, giving them the ability to predict and counteract German attacks. It allowed the Allies to strike with unparalleled precision, forcing the Luftwaffe to retreat into a defensive posture from which they could not recover. The realization that they could no longer surprise or outmaneuver the Allies in the air was devastating. It shattered the myth of the German military's invincibility and exposed the vulnerability of a regime built on technological arrogance and blind loyalty to its leaders. For the Allies, the mastery of radar technology in the skies was a triumph of innovation and adaptability. Where once they had been vulnerable to surprise air raids, they now stood as the dominant force in the air. The ability to detect enemy aircraft before they even entered the fray shifted the entire strategy of the war. What had once been a battle of speed and skill had transformed into a battle of technology, and the Allies had seized that advantage. The success of radar-equipped bombers and the strategic use of long-range fighters, such as the P-51, Mustang allowed the United States and Britain to carry out bombing raids deep into enemy territory with impunity, devastating German cities and industries without fear of retaliation. The psychological effect of radar on the Luftwaffe pilots cannot be understated. These men had been trained to fight in the skies, their success built on their ability to outfight and outthink their enemies. Now, faced with a foe who could anticipate their every move, they were forced into a new reality, one where the technology of war had surpassed their own skill and tactics. The emotional toll on the pilots was immense, as they faced not only the destruction of their aircraft, but the erosion of their identity as the elite force of the skies. The once proud Luftwaffe pilots, hailed as heroes, were now fighting a war they could no longer win. The broader implications of the shift in air power are still felt today. The lessons learned from the development and deployment of radar during World War II reshaped the future of aerial combat. Radar systems, once seen as defensive tools, became integral to offensive strategies, allowing air forces to coordinate strikes with precision and foresight. The victory over the Luftwaffe, aided by radar, showcased the transformative power of technology in warfare. It demonstrated that innovation could tip the scales of a conflict, turning the tide of a war and shifting the balance of power in unexpected ways. For the German civilian population, the collapse of the Luftwaffe meant the inevitable intensification of Allied bombing campaigns. The loss of air superiority directly contributed to the destruction of key cities, industrial hubs, and civilian infrastructure as the Allies began to strike with unparalleled force. The psychological toll on the civilian population was immense as they watched their cities burn, their homes destroyed, and their country's military machine collapse. The loss of the Luftwaffe also symbolized the collapse of Nazi Germany's defense capabilities, signaling the inevitable defeat of Hitler's regime. In the final analysis, the introduction of radar technology and its strategic application by the Allies marked one of the most decisive factors in the Allied victory in Europe. It was not just a technological triumph, it was a turning point in the nature of warfare itself. What began as a tool for detection became a weapon of overwhelming superiority, allowing the Allies to dominate the skies and ultimately bring about the fall of Nazi Germany. Radar, once an underestimated tool, became the cornerstone of Allied air superiority and a defining feature of the air war in Europe. It changed the course of history, ensuring that the skies over Europe would never again be contested in the same way. As we reflect on this monumental shift, we are reminded of the incredible power of technological innovation in warfare. The success of radar is not just a story of military victory. It is a story of how the relentless pursuit of innovation and the willingness to adapt to new realities can change the course of history. The Luftwaffe's downfall at the hands of radar-equipped bombers and Allied fighters is a powerful reminder that, in the end, technology, when paired with strategy and resilience, can shift the tide of war and bring about victory even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.